Former British Labour MP Lord Peter Hain says state capture and corruption can't only be aligned with government and public officials, but also the private sector. The former anti-apartheid campaigner told the Zondo Commission he found it strange that those in authority in South Africa hadn't seen the warning signs of state capture, yet it was all over the media. Our reporter Manqoba Mchunu joins us this evening. Good evening, Manqoba. Let's start with why did Lord Peter Hain, come to the Zondo Commission to come and testify?
Well, of course, Peter Hain says he has a vested, interest in South Africa, having also grown here in South Africa to parents that were also apartheid anti-activists. And he says himself, when they went to exile, when he was in the UK, he also became an anti-apartheid activist. And he says his heart is really vested in South Africa. And that's the reason why he says he has been making noise about the state capture in South Africa since 2017, when those Gupta leaks emerged. And of course, he says during that time, that's when he also took a vested interest to ensure that, he campaigns against state capture, and also he lobbies the UK parliamentarians to act against state capture. So he says he literally has a vested interest, having grown up in South Africa as a young boy, and also, feeling that he's part of South Africa.
And then, of course, he listed the number of banks that he thought that those banks were complicit, including the Bank of Baroda.
Of course, Aldrin, and all of these banks that he mentioned, we all know these were banks that worked with the Gupta family. These were banks that have been mentioned in some of the illicit transactions that took place during that time of alleged state capture. To mention the Bank of Baroda, of course, we know some of the controversies around it. We know also the Standard Chartered Bank, which has also been linked to the money laundering in the Daily Stina project. You recall that there was an amount of about 30 million rand that was laundered through Dubai, and then it came back to fund that Gupta wedding in Northwest. And of course,
and then he actually mentions KPMG, and he says that a KPMG consultant helped with funneling that money.
Exactly, Aldrin. And he says many of these corporations and these banks simply turned a blind eye. He says most of them were either complicit or they either aided in state capture. He says, the fact that the banks hide behind a confidentiality clause and say, no, we didn't know, or, we simply cannot, we couldn't tell that this was happening, is simply not enough. He says it's unacceptable because they are the first line of defense. They should have been the first line of defense. They have the client's information, and they should have known what was happening. And of course, there was information around the media of what was happening.
But what about the Financial Intelligence Center Act? Because the FICA is supposed to also take note of these things. Did he mention that at all? Well,
of course, he says that, all of those things didn't happen. And he says this is really strange because there were red flags all over. I mean, there were, media reports at the time that suggested that there was something illicit going on between the Guptas and their relationship with also the former president also coming under scrutiny. So he says the fact that all of these were bypassed and the fact that these banks and these global companies actually, opened the door for the Guptas to access the international network is simply, something that is amazing at how it happened. He says it's actually strange that, these global companies went to the extent that they went, despite the red flags that were there at the time.
And then he blames the governments or certain governments that have created a haven for the Gupta brothers, but also South Africa, that you haven't been acting.
Of course, he says, up until this day, it's still strange that, the Gupta brothers have not, there's no action that has been taken against them. You recall that last month, the US, imposed those sanctions against the Gupta brothers, but it's the only country that has done that. And he says, of course, that it's, it's baffling why South Africa has not followed suit. And also, he says he's also written to the UK to also follow suit and do the same, impose those sanctions. But he says, those countries should equally take responsibility for the money laundering, for the crime activities that happened, because they should have seen these things happen under their watch.
Thank you so much, Manqoba Mchunu. And actually, a bit later on, we will be speaking to Lord Peter Hain just after 7 o'clock, so stay tuned.